Welcome to the second Humanities Forum event of the spring semester. My name is Rebecca Bowling, and I'm the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities. And we are very pleased this evening to have a panel discussion on transmodernism. But before we get to that, I just want to tell you a little bit about our program, which you'll notice in the back if you don't already have one, and if you're faculty, you probably have already gotten one of these in your mailbox because I hand-delivered them a few weeks ago. But this is our second event, and after, after this one, we have Women's History Month on the 11th of March, which will be the Muslim headscarf in Europe, veiled threat or religious freedom. Dr. Claudia Kunz is coming from the Department of History at Duke University, and that's going to be quite an interesting lecture, I think. And then on the 25th of March, we have the Daphne Harrison Lecture, Gaining Information, Knowledge, and Power in the 21st Century, and we'll be having Dr. Carla Hayden, who is the director of the Enoch Pratt Library. And some of you may know that Dr. Hayden came to us from Chicago, and that she played a very important role in holding her own with the American Library Association in making sure that the Patriot Act would not be able to give the government access to library records in terms of who's checking out what books, etc. So I think she's going to, even though she's not going to talk about that specifically, I think we're very lucky to have her on all sorts of levels. And then on the 15th of April, we're having a reading, a novel reading, reading from a new novel, Last One In by Elise Levine, who will be teaching in our English department next semester. And then on the 30th of April, we have our second annual Lipids lecture by one of our own visual arts professors, John Sturgeon, who's going to be talking on the poetic narrative, nonlinear strategies for digital cinema. So we've got an interesting lineup. Tonight is, of course, a little more in the arts category. And one of the other things besides the brochures that I want to draw your attention to is that we are back to our Drescher Center buttons. Those of you who have been to other Drescher Center events in the last couple of semesters have noticed that intermittently we have new buttons with new quotes from the humanities, and tonight's is life-transforming ideas have always come to me through books. Does anybody know who said that? No? No extra points out there? No extra credit? Bell hooks. Now, with transmodernism, we're not just sticking to books. We're going to be very visual this evening. And I'm going to turn over the show in just a moment to our moderator, Dr. Preminda Jacob, but I first want to introduce her. Dr. Preminda Jacob is Associate Chair of the Department of Visual Arts here at UMBC, in which she is, of course, an Associate Professor. She is an art historian of modern and contemporary art, specializing in social and political aspects of public visual culture. She also works on the history and theory of the Art Museum. Her book, Celluloid Deities, The Visual Culture of Cinema and Politics in South India, was published this year by Lexington Books, a division of Rowman and Littlefield Publishers. Dr. Jacob holds a PhD in art history from the University of California, Los Angeles, and was educated both in India and the United States. She has been teaching courses in art history and theory at UMBC since 1995. And we're very pleased to have her and the rest of the panel, whom she will introduce. Thank you.
Welcome, all of you. I just wanted to say, give you a little heads up on how we're going to be organizing the discussion today. Each of the speakers, I'll introduce them as just before they speak, and then they'll each speak for around 10 minutes. And then at the end of that, we're hoping to open up the floor to discussion with the group. So we're hoping that it'll be a very animated discussion. So please, while the speakers are giving their presentations, their short presentations, please think of interesting questions so that we can have an animated discussion. I'm also here we're waiting to hear about what transmodernism is. I think this is the like I think the second month I've been aware of this term. I mean, so so it'll be an educative experience. And I'm, as after hearing about this term, I suddenly began noticing all the other transes, the transcendent and the transhistorical and the transcultural and the transnational. So we'll see how transmodernism fits into this new way of thinking about our world. So I'd like to first introduce James Mahoney. James Mahoney is an artist, independent curator, and art critic who serves as Washington's corresponding editor for Art in America. He has been an adjunct professor of fine art at UMBC since 1996 and was the Hirshhorn Museum's assistant registrar and information manager for over 25 years. His engagement with transmodernity began in 1992 in his curated exhibition titled Transmodern at the Baumgartner Galleries in Washington. And this engagement has continued since, most recently in Baltimore's 5th Transmodern Festival this last spring, in which he distributed a Transmodern manifesto, still a work in progress since 1992. So, James.
My computer is very strange. It doesn't open except when it feels like it. You have to sort of, I did it. That's good. It's very good. I always wear 2 pair of glasses, if necessary. So let me bring up this thing. Oh, it came up so fast. Good, good. Oh, warmed up. Okay. Well, can you hear me? Oh, I suppose. I used to be a lead singer in a rock and roll band, and mic control is, sometimes not the easiest thing in the world. It seems to be, but it's not. Christian knows about this. Let me go back to the other image. God. Okay. Forgive me. I'm going to show you the whole bloody lecture. Let me get out of that. I don't want to do that. It gives away everything. Well, the reason I'm showing you this image is that it's Yoko Ono's birthday. And I did a piece in 2002, a large article for Art in America called Transmodern Yoko, in which they asked me pretty seriously to define transmodernism, not by postmodernism, but by what it essentially is. Now, one of the things about first and last about the idea of the transmodern is that it's an attitude. It's a set of ideas, the same way postmodernism was. There is no real definition for it, but there are a lot of good ones out there. And I'll read you a few of them as I go along. But I thought I invented the term. In 1992, I did a show at Baumgartner Galleries in D.C. And it was my considered opinion that we were in a new phase of art making. It seemed as if the 20th century had sort of had 2 very significant phases. Modernity, which was very forward-looking, very proactive, and went to a lot of places at once. And then the postmodern, which was basically a refraction. It was a matter of going back in and rehearsing all the techniques and all the strategies of modernism and to find out whether or not these things really deeply applied. Postmodernism had everything to do with critique. And as a backward looking, I thought it was extremely necessary for culture to do it. But by 1992, I had a very powerful sense that other forces were at work. That instead of something like critique as being a final value, I thought rich uncertainty, openness, uncertainty, was going to be the next sort of flow. It felt right. There was a lot of information. There were a lot of artists. There were a lot of practitioners of art who were not in any way connected directly to the discourse. The discourse, what I mean by that, of course, is Art Forum magazine. But, the thing with transmodernity is I began to discover that I was not the only person who invented transmodernity. Was that it was very much like the old story of the blind man and the elephant, in which the story, of course, goes you take 7 or 8 blind men and they experience an elephant and they come away from the elephant and they're all quite clear about their experience. One says an elephant is a rope because they grab the tail. One says an elephant is like a banana leaf because they grab the ear. Someone else grabbed one of the legs and decided that an elephant is like a tree. And of course it goes on from there. What's really lovely about the concept of transmodernity is that in some respects, it's nice to have a word for the fact that everything's different now. I'm going to read you a quote from a guy named Luc Sant, who wrote a piece in 1999 in the New York Times Sunday magazine. Good, it's working. Anyway, Luc Sant said, "The art of the future in The Triumph of the Image," New York Times Sunday magazine, September 19th, 1999. "The art of the future is anybody's guess. What can possibly succeed the profusion of everything all at once? What can possibly seem new after high and low, crudity and refinement, overload and minimalism have all riotously coexisted? Will strict academic standards reappear as the search begins for some tortuous path to exclusivity? What is most likely," he wrote this thing at the end of the article too, this is his last paragraph, "what is most likely is that some hitherto invisible pattern will emerge, some thread of connection between technology and tradition and junk, and a dozen widely scattered artists will stumble upon it separately, and it will seem discordant at first, then inspired, then inevitable." What a lovely idea. It's essentially, when I began to find out that there were other people who'd done stuff with the transmodern, most particularly a Spanish woman who wrote a book in 1989 called La Transmodernidad, Rosa Maria Rodriguez Magda, who's just republished the Transmodern, and I think there's an English translation of it on her website. Anybody, if you need to know the URL, I'll give it to you. It's fascinating. It's an interesting idea. Basically what she says, to sum up a very great deal in a few words, is that essentially, as I said before, modernity constitutes in a Hegelian analysis a thesis. Postmodernism an antithesis, and transmodernism a synthesis. Well, as I've been thinking about the transmodern myself, it's been, I've mainly looked at it in terms of aesthetic terms. Well, what constitutes newness in art these days? What's new? What practices are new practices? I've come up with 3 ideas, and I think some of my students have already been plagued with some of this already. But in any event, the transmodern for my system consists of the liminal, that is to say, threshold conditions, the littoral, which is like what washes up on the shores of culture from the other. Anything that washes up is littoral, from women, from other cultures, whatever. And the final, strangest characteristic is singularity. Now, singularity is an interesting word. There's a guy named Kurzweil who's got a book called The Singularity is Near, having to do with this merge of technology and biology. Interesting book, pretty scary. Is it transmodern? Sure. In any event, when I look at a piece like this of Yoko's, these are 4 keys to open the sky. All the Beatles own one of these themselves each, you know. And Paul lost his, by the way. What I'm seeing here is very much a combination of all 3 at once. In other words, the idea of separating out, you know, threshold conditions and singularity. That is to say, something you've never seen before ever, and it's going to change your life because you've never seen it before. And this idea of littoral, of basically mining world culture for anything that comes up, not for the sake of Western art discourse, but because it's interesting, because it's cool. Jeff Wall. I want to show you this because this describes very much transmodern liminality. We're all in an in-between space. we're in a process of changing from one set or a great number of things that we already know about into something we've never known about before. We're at a time in which there's going to be a green revolution, which is going to transform everything. We're also at a time, and quite a number of transmodern writers are liberation theologists or theologians. I'll read you some quotes from some of these people. In many respects, the transmodern is very much a social transformation, as well as any kind of aesthetic transformation. But we are in this strange in-between space, and investigating that in-between space is, I think, going to be a very, very exciting prospect. This is one of Andrew Wyeth's last paintings. It's called Morning Star. Basically, what Wyeth would do is he would go around in his neighborhood in Pennsylvania with a sketch pad, and he was licensed by his neighbors to go anywhere he wanted to and do anything he wanted to. This was made from a sketch that he made while this couple were asleep just before dawn. And you can't really see the dot in this image, but there is a dot in the landscape, which is in fact Venus. But the idea of investigating, transforming things that so they may have a lot of uncertainty about them, really carry forward into tremendous conditions of beauty, really matter. We are learning in transmodern conditions to accept the beauties in other cultures, to accept other cultures on their own terms, which is pretty scary. But also to because we're in this liminal condition, to allow that liminality, that permeable membrane to draw in things that we've never seen before, and accepting these things on their own terms is a really vital thing. This is Philip Taft. This is, as far as I'm concerned, this is quite littoral. This stuff is all stuff which has washed up on the shore. And he's like a beachcomber. He's finding what he finds interesting, taking it, bringing it home, doing something with it. It's interesting because, I mean, one of the things, you think about the possible sort of transcendent aspect of transmodernity, and it's interesting to look at the definition of transcendence that Herman Marcuse developed in One-Dimensional Man. This is in the introduction. He talked about the idea of transcendence not necessarily being religious at all, but a condition in which one makes a leap over existing boundaries into real possibilities. Those are his exact words. This is the condition in which we're functioning now, I believe, firmly. And look what we're coming up with. It's not that this is supposed to be necessarily interpretable, but it's engageable. In other words, we cross a threshold into an unknowable and see what happens. In other cultures too, other cultural values. Japanese culture has a deep level engagement with the aesthetics of silence and the idea of melancholy failure. We in the West don't deal with melancholy failure at all. In Asian cultures, they do, because basically they have a completely different worldview. It's reincarnational. They believe that the life itself is this continuing spiral. But the singular, the radically singular, something you've absolutely never seen before, that you can use as a portal to go from one place to another. This is Martin Purrier. This is a fairly recent sculpture. What's useful about this is not that it provides that this is a word in a discourse. What's useful about this is that it contains a great deal of mystery. And this mystery is bigger than we are. It's very important for us to begin to accept the idea that great art is not necessarily rational. It's transrational. And when we are willing to accept the transrational, we're going to come up with a lot more interesting results. This is Tom Friedman. This is actually very, 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 very small. This is another singularity. Basically, this is a capsule, and it contains little balls of Play-Doh. How he made these balls that small, the Lord knows. Anyway, that's Tom Frieden. I want to read you a few of the things that basically transmodernists seem to be saying about it. And again, this is a situation in which, 2 minutes, okay, perfect, wahoo, all right, here we go. This is what I said about it in 1999. I said, it has been useful for me to use the term transmodern for what is more apparently a liminal phase in contemporary art that can't be identified as postmodern anymore, but isn't also a return to closed traditional aesthetic positions. We are in threshold conditions in which the deeper modernist myths are becoming irrelevant, especially those that have supported postmodernist criticality so significantly. Now, here are the words of Enrique Dussel, who's a Latin American writer and philosopher who's one of the greatest exponents of liberation theology. He says this is really kind of fascinating. He says, are you all transmodernists, cultural creatives? Possibly 44 million in the United States alone are at the forefront of the transmodern revolution. Postmodernity was characterized by a rejection of reality. Carried to an extreme of postmodern has no basis for preferring science over pseudoscience or liberation over oppression. Everything becomes relative. Transmodernity, on the other hand, advocates a critical realism. Truth and reality exist, but in the parable of blind men and the elephant, there's that one. They can be understood from many different perspectives. Core values include family, relationships, environment, health, civil rights, sustainable living, spirituality, and community. Now, this is the thing. This has nothing whatever to do with words, with aesthetic words like liminality or singularity. It's just another way of looking at this flow. I said myself in 1992 when I was writing about the transmodern, I said my suggestion in transmodern is that contemporary art is beginning to confront more philosophically mature issues than that of its immediate survival in fashion-conscious culture. Well, I think what we're going to be seeing, and this is what's going to be the most vital thing of all, is that it's one thing to declare that we're in a revolution if the revolution doesn't happen, right? We can talk about what a great revolution we're having, and how we're going to really do it right. We can sound like old Marxists until our hair falls out. But the fact is that not to be too hackneyed about it, but the transmodern is you and me. I mean, we're all in this together. This period of history most likely is going to be characterized by something or other, and it's certainly quite obvious that certainly by the time postmodernity was going on, everybody recognized it as such. Like, oh yeah, these are postmodern times, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. Okay, well, people have for quite a number of years been referring to what's been going on these days as postmodern. And I think it's time a new word started to get used. Anyway, thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Catherine Pancake. She's an artist and cultural worker living in Baltimore. Her personal work ranges from obscure experiments with unusual sound aesthetics to feature-length narrative documentaries. Catherine's work with experimental sound has been published by several experimental record labels, as well as featured in a tour of Asia, where, among other things, she collaborated with the Shanghai Modern Dance Troupe. Her films have been widely screened in university, museum, and community settings. Her film work garnered national acclaim, including a 2008 selection documentary fortnight at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Catherine's cultural work in Baltimore has been expressed through the co-founding of several core grassroots radical arts organizations, including the Transmodern Festival.
Thanks very much for having me to your school. I'm going to just talk a little bit about off the cuff before I start the presentation, but I think mainly I'm here doing a presentation because I'm involved with a festival called the Transmodern Festival, and there are several participants in the audience, which I'd like to see. And I'll just give a little anecdotal information about that. I've been doing I've been interested in experimental culture for a long time. I'm not an academic. I don't have a degree in art, but I'm very interested in arts and culture, and I approach that in a very sort of direct and direct action way. And through my own work and through what we call cultural work, which is basically people getting together in collectives who are interested in art and culture and forming performance series and festivals. So the first one that I did in Baltimore, and these collectives, I think in Baltimore it's kind of unusual because there are quite a few of these collectives and they're self-sustaining, and some of them have become nonprofits, but it's unusual for these kind of collectives to emerge and be sustained as long as they are in Baltimore. And I think that might have a little bit to do with the economic status of the city, but I did an experimental music collective called The Red Room for a long, long time, and it's basically focused primarily on music. And when we started the collective, we were very clear that it was going to be focused on aesthetics only, that we weren't going to deal with diversity, that we weren't going to deal with politics, that we weren't going to be a leftist group, that we were purely going to be interested in the aesthetics of experimental sound. So I did that for 7 years, and through that process, I became dissatisfied that aesthetics were actually solving the problems around me. So I was interested in experimental aesthetics and aesthetics purely, but I also saw that it wasn't integrated in other things that were interesting to me in terms of feminist thought and queer and gender issues and different environmental issues that I'd become involved with personally. So one of the ways that I sort of decided I would try to kind of socially engineer more diversity and more multidisciplinary work in experimental culture in Baltimore was to start this new festival called the Transmodern Festival. So anyway, we didn't know about transmodernism and form the festival based on those theories. We liked some of the ideas that transmodernism or the transmodern, thank you, the transmodern sort of talk about, which is the maintaining of certain of tradition, and marrying that with high art, also the kind of feminist collective spirit that's in transmodern. And we also like this idea that the transmodern is something that is a bridge that kind of like works in and amongst the cracks and kind of joins together different disciplines and joins together different movements. So we saw the festival as something that would infiltrate into different areas in the city and bring divergent people doing multidisciplinary work into in kind of an invasive way almost to inhabit these different places. So anyway, with that said, let me start the PowerPoint. Anyway, so I'm calling this Transmodern Tactics in Contemporary Creative Settings. It's my lovely title. So when I was doing this this PowerPoint in the school, I had to get kind of schooled myself on how I was going to contextualize this. So I just put together a little slide about some quick definitions: modern art, postmodern art, transmodern. Modern art, throwing off of classicism and tradition, this spirit of experimentation, new vision. I've also been interested recently in Adolf Loos' essay "Ornament and Crime." Do you know that essay? In which it's an early modern kind of manifesto from 1908, in which he's an Austrian architect and he decides that ornamentation makes things sort of go out of style, and so it needs to be abolished. So sort of ornamentation as part of kind of classicism and these smooth surfaces and this new ideas, and we're going to get rid of like this kind of ornamentation and adornment in a certain way in architecture, which kind of to me is a thrust of modernity that a lot of people have sort of issues with. Part of his theory were that sort of indigenous people tattooing all these things were not only degenerate but actually sort of crimes against aesthetics. So there's this strong push in modernity where the kind of some traditional modes are not only excluded but they're talked about as being degenerate. So I have some issues with that. But anyway, so I'm kind of interested in that thrust of modernity, but also I love modern art as well. So just some kind of tension in there. Postmodern art, as Craig already talked about, this is kind of some kind of reaction to modern art. Something's going not satisfying about modern art, and post-60s forward. There's tons of different forms and movements, minimalism, fluxus. This is considered to be sort of reactive, sort of revolutionary. Ooh, where'd you go? I mean, most of the kind of like really far out, really fun stuff that I like is considered postmodern. In terms of very obscure work that's not concerned with audience, work that's concerned with being provocative and kind of, the birth of conceptual art, etc. It also has its own issues, but when we talk about transmodern, in this we're kind of talking about bridging together the modern and the postmodern with some of these new ideas that I'm sort of listing as universalism, community, tradition, confluence. Feminism to me is very strongly in there, and kind of multidisciplinary work. Again, we're looking at the trans and transmodern as I kind of looked at the etymology of trans. It's sort of going across, beyond, but joining things together. Not necessarily a break. I mean, I guess Craig and James and I could talk about that, but I don't necessarily see it as a break or a new thing as much as a joining and a kind of a malleable kind of showing the relationships between other things as well. So the Transmodern Festival in itself, I consider kind of a transmodern act because of its collective nature. We're run as a grassroots collective. None of us get paid. We all volunteer our time. I feel that it kind of bridges together some of these movements in a new thing. In my view, transmodern and my approach toward creativity is very rooted in direct action. I love theory and do a lot of theoretical reading, but I'm really interested in where kind of art comes into reality, where art kind of touches normal human beings, being outside of the academy, being outside of institutions, not being dictated by the academy or by institutions, but being dictated by sort of humans in the world who have creative spirits. We engage in real politic. That means in our festival, we do bring up issues or controversy. It's allowable for you to say things that may not be politically acceptable in a place that's more formal. We do admire and aspire to high art. The festival performers are 90% people with degrees and postgraduate degrees in art. So it's not arts and crafts, and it's not folk art. It is kind of aspiring to high art. And when we do the festival, I'm saying that it provides sort of human junctures and these experiential joints, which you'll see in some of the slides that I bring up, for people to enter into new forms and new disciplines in a very inclusive way that's on the street and kind of pedestrian. We also aggressively and openly promote diversity. We don't every once in a while have a woman or every once in a while have something that's related to diversity. We aggressively and openly promote that right out front, and we want that to be in the forefront. Anyway, last year we had about 60 artists and about 800 audience. So I just want to talk a little bit about a couple of the artists that we had last year and why I think they're kind of transmodern, why I think they're interesting. This slide relates to a woman named Anna Oxygen, who is a multidisciplinary artist who is kind of interesting in that she takes, this piece sort of takes the form of dance pop, which is typically a form of popular music that's engaged with a lot of commercialism, that's engaged with a lot of marketing. And she takes that, as she dislocates it, it makes it kind of a communal experience where there's lots of dancing, there's lots of she gives kind of communal commands for people doing exercise. So it's not just watching someone on the stage. The people are engaged in this communal activity that has a lot of kind of physical contact, such as this, which is I think Teresa's in there, which is pretty fun. So the whole piece, you're taking people out of a normal museum setting or a normal setting, and you're engaging them with each other and with the creative moment in a new way. Another artist that I'm particularly interested in is Mahoney. She is a performance artist. I particularly like her statement in terms of that her subject matter includes but is not limited to location, movement, mass, and presence. This is kind of a very, these are abstract kind of thoughts, but it speaks to her not using traditional canvas or traditional media, but she's using time, space, area, and location as her canvas. And the piece that she did last year, she's kind of taking it to a different level by moving in space. So they did this piece in an alley behind the Loda Fund Studios near North Avenue, which is a very dangerous street in Baltimore. And she's playing with social movements. It's kind of postmodern, but it's kind of moving into the transmodern. So they created this militia of mimes. They use these very iconic kind of social groups, I don't want to say transgressive, but groups that have created a lot of emotions in people. Actually, Panther, Nazi, hippie, they're kind of people were acting in different ways. So in the piece they were not only performing in an outdoor alley, but they were confronting people with these kind of archetypes. Another piece that I think is very interesting is Zoe Carlton and Cameron Ayers. I call this the immaterial, both of these I call the immaterial social because they're art pieces that don't happen with traditional materials, but they also use social relationships as an arena for discourse. And in this piece, this was all about creating a conversation. The piece is called The Good Taste Committee. So they're on the street on North Avenue, which is right in an urban area in Baltimore, and they're stopping passerbys and they're engaging them in this game called Segway, in which they give people 3 different things to talk about, and then there are rules to the game, and they're using like kind of the parlor, the family, the social as an art form. Talking about traditional forms in transmodern, this is a couple pieces. Laura Emily and this walking stick, she created kind of traditional walking sticks for people to walk around the event. So the walking stick itself became part of the piece. Kind of one of the crystallizing artists of our festival last year, we'll be back this year, is Tuck Down Nigon. And she has a piece called Street Hawker. This piece probably has all of the elements of the transmodern you can imagine. She comes from a traditional Vietnamese perspective. She goes into an urban area, and she makes spring rolls out of plants and weeds that are actually in the area where she's working. So she's using and highlighting the ecology of the city, herbs, plants, weeds that are typically overlooked. She's integrating them into her creative act. She's presenting it in a traditional way, but in a highly dislocated place. So I really love this piece. A couple other things that I've just, one person that's like the queen of the universe, Jib's camera. Another thing that we do address in the festival is a feminist genderqueer. And I had a small video, but I'm not going to have time to play it. It's not really working that well. But if you go online and you look up Dynasty Handbag, she's very interesting. She's very openly feminist, and she's also openly queer. Her work is interesting because she plays off of this character that sort of displays kind of in a very humorous and aggressive way the kind of shame and silence that many people who are out, gay people or queer people, experience in terms of am I really here? Am I really located in this environment? Is this really me? So it's just kind of, that's a bit of an abstract expression, but it's extremely engaging, extremely funny, but it also gets at the core root of some very interesting feminist ideas that I don't think are expressed very frequently. Also, we had Catastrophe last year, who is a trans guy performer. It's kind of interesting in the festival because he was actually fully passing in the festival. So there was some question, why were we having just a typical rapper in our festival? It was not clear to people that he was trans. So I find that I'm very interested in those modalities and those social relationships when trans people choose and don't choose to pass, and how that comes about and how that happens in terms of creative productivity. So anyway, I am done, and thank you very much.
our last speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Dori Tunstall. She's an associate professor of design anthropology at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the School of Art and Design, where she teaches research methods for art and design and critical design and governance courses. She's a leader in the field of design anthropology. This is an emerging field that seeks to understand how the processes and artifacts of design help to define what it means to be human, and to increase the strategic value of human-centered design to business, government, and society. Dr. Tunstall has conducted strategic civic design projects on US voting, emergency, and evacuation. She's currently an organizer for the US National Design Policy Summit and Initiative. She has a PhD from Stanford University and a BA in anthropology, PhD in anthropology and a BA in anthropology from Bryn Mawr College.
Hello. First, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today. Get out of this. Where am I here? View. Slideshow. So the title of my talk is In Design We Trust. Transmodern values of democracy and the thinginess of government, and I'll explain all of these terms. But first I'm going to start with a story about government cheese. My first, it's playing. Oh, let's see, pause, go back. There we go. My first experience with the US federal government came in the form of a plain brown cardboard rectangular box, inside of which was a bright orange-yellow block of government cheese. So this is in the 1980s, so I'm only about 10 or 11 years old at the time, and I was mortified that my father had brought home a box of government cheese. And it wasn't about the cheese, because I grew up in Indiana, so Velveeta was a staple in our diet. It was more about what this undecorated box said about our family. Now, I grew up, with the honor of being working class, but this box said something different. It said that we were poor, and it said that we were poor in the eyes of the government, but probably, being 10 years old, more importantly for me, it said it was poor in the eyes of my neighborhood friends. And at the time, I knew absolutely nothing about the 1982 Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program of the Food and Nutritional Service. I did know that my stable working class neighborhood was becoming infested with drugs and gangs. I knew that my friends' parents had begun to lose their high-paying manufacturing jobs, and I definitely knew that I didn't trust the government. And then, again, this distrust wasn't experienced as sort of abstract government policy or even Reaganomics, which was, becoming the term, but it was experienced as a plain brown cardboard rectangular box, again, inside of which was a block of processed cheese food. So now that I understand policy better, I'm still amazed to the extent which my experiences of government is through things. It's experienced as, the form I have to fill out at the DMV, displaying my driver's license when I'm traveling, and, annual tax forms and informations and ballots and parking meters. It's through things, it's through stuff. And sometimes these things are designed, and oftentimes they are not, by professional designers. But again, like my experience with the anti-design of the brown cardboard box of government cheese, it's amazing to realize how the formal elements of design, such as color, texture, shape, affect both the functional as well as the symbolic understanding of people's relationships to the US government at federal, state, and local levels. So this really makes me think about how, more than the laws and the policies that define government thought, things actually reflect the lived practices of government, and more importantly, the focus on the thinginess of government is an important means by which everyday people understand as tangible, meaning things that can be seen, smelled, tasted, heard, and felt, experiences with the contradictions inherent in American democratic values. Talking about trust and democratic values and tangible experiences, and if you ask civic experts, and being so close from Washington, D.C., there are so many of them, what are American democratic values? They'll talk about, values of popular sovereignty and minority protection and based on separations of powers and checks and balances and federalism and the common good and individual rights for right, liberty, freedom of press, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That probably if you ask the same question to the sort of average American person, they may mention, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, maybe rule by the people. But as I tried to explore what are actually American democratic values, I actually went back to the original documents of the founding of the United States, or the Declaration of Independence, of course, the Articles of the Confederation, the Constitution, Jefferson's notes on the Congress proceedings, the Federalist Papers. I read all of them. And what was fascinating to read the original documents is that in the markouts and the additions that you find in the draft form of them, I came up what I think is actually the most defining American democratic value, and that is the right to acquire and possess property. And it's really interesting because when Jefferson wrote the American sort of, Declaration of Independence, he based it on the Virginia version here, but actually took out the idea of with the means of acquiring and possessing property. And historian Pauline Mayer notes that the reason why he could do that was that everyone at his time, his contemporaries, understood that happiness would include the acquiring and possessing of property. So, as she sort of says that, perhaps Jefferson sacrificed the clarity of meaning for the grace of language. So I propose that, in fact, the story of American democracy is the contradictions between the values of the rights to life and liberty and the value of the pursuit of happiness experienced as the right to acquire and possess property. And that it's no more apparent than in the design of American voting ballots, where, again, the right to liberty expressed through casting your vote is always in conflict with wealthy bosses' rights to acquire and possess property, expressed through the wonderful phenomena of election fraud. And so to dive into this, I'm only going to choose one element of design, which is that of color. And color is one of the most important design elements because it's, again, both informational as well as being emotional. So I'm going to talk about the role of color in the design of traditional, modern, and transmodern democratic values as experienced through American ballots. And this notion of traditional, modern, and transmodern is based on the sort of worldview framework of Paul Ray. So, traditional ballots. Into the election reforms of the 1880s, individual political parties actually distributed ballots at the local level. And Tracy Campbell, in the book Delivering the Vote, he talks about how they were printed on different sizes and different colors to really address the problem of illiteracy among the white immigrant male and property populations who were actually allowed to vote. And the high visibility of the voters' support enabled partisans, again, who were printing out the ballot, to basically intimidate and harass voters who do not support their candidate. So unlike today, where we sort of, identify red with, a specific political party and blue with the other, that at the time there came in various colors. And they talk about, and there were many different parties than just the Republicans and Democrats. So he talks about that in the August election in 1885, the Know Nothing Party, I love that, was able to intimidate voters except for those who openly displayed yellow ballots. So again, the objectives of the form of intimidations were for local party leaders to control the ballot box. And why? If you controlled the ballot box, you were able to control the government lands and contracts, which you could then use to accrue personal wealth as, again, white men with property. So everyone got tired of this. And so what happens in sort of the modern period, you have this sort of reformation that goes on in terms of both the ideals of the democratic values as well as ballot design. So in 1880, there's the legal case of Henshaw versus Foster, in which it was decided in the case that the printing of tickets on varied multicolored paper was said to destroy the secrecy of the vote. Thus, in 1831, Maine, the state of Maine, required that, quote, ballots should be printed on clean white paper without any distinguishing mark or figure besides the name of the persons voted for and the office for which was intended, and color ballots were strictly forbidden. So under this sort of called the Australian ballot reforms, because the ballot that everyone was saying you should have, what came from Australia, almost by the 1900s, almost all of the states required that paper ballots be printed on plain white paper. And what's really important about this Reformation is that the notion of liberty, or the justification for these reformations, was based on a notion of liberty which was couched in the discourse of standardization and efficiency of procedures, and counter to the fraudulent practices in which sort of, county political machines and even the electorate would sell their votes. And so this continues with, the punch card ballot, again, look all the notice the white, until we encounter basically the infamous butterfly ballot in 2000. And this is where I come into play, because I worked with an organization called Design for Democracy, which worked on the redesign of ballots after this moment. And so again, one of the things to realize is with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Help America Vote Act of 2002, the landscape for election design changed. First of all, the two acts helped truly extend the value of liberty of voting to African Americans, minority language speakers, peoples with disabilities, including the blind and those with visual impairments. And so the touchscreen ballot, as in many ways the most accessible form of voting, the controversy surrounding these actually exposes the messiness of these transmodern values that we have. Because you have issues of environmental sustainability with the ideal of the paperless ballot versus having the verifiable paper trail. You have issues of universal accessibility clash then with modernist concerns of sort of technical ballot fraud. And what becomes interesting is that it's the machine and its programmers who's the source of fraud, no longer political bosses or even the voter who sells his or her vote. So with the ballot that we developed for in the organization Design for Democracy, we reintroduced color. When we reintroduced color specifically in the part of the instructions so that the ideal that people could understand the process of voting and what it is they need to do as they encounter these newly designed ballots. And what becomes, again, interesting and messy is that user testing showed that the way we designed it with the color separation and the use of sort of visuals gave people more time to read the instructions, they felt more confident voting, and were voting more accurately. But then the election officials started to get upset because people were spending too much time reading the ballot, which would mean that voters would move less efficiently through the polling place. And again, this is a real issue because I vote in Chicago, so there are like 2 or 3 hour waits. But again, it's sort of this sense of that in this transmodern moment, all of these sort of different value systems are apparent and often clash. So it's the thinkiness of the ballot and the voters' experiences that make these conflicting value systems in contemporary democracy actually apparent. So one of the things I talk about in my work of design and government is that design translates values into tangible experiences. And in the history of ballot design, we've had many different values. So we have the notions of democracy, but the values attached to it in a traditional Democracy, again, with the color ballots and lots of corruption. The sort of modernist response to that in terms of standardization and efficiency of process is very different from the transmodern moment, where you have to develop a system that is inclusive of all of the different types of diversity, of ability, of language, of reading levels, that make this process of creating something in the contemporary moment much more complex than any other time that you could possibly imagine. But again, design is the way to make these things apparent, and design becomes the thinginess of design is actually what alarms us to the required vigilance we need to have in terms of guarding liberty and redefining happiness, so that it's not based on the acquisition and possession of property by stealing it from others. Thank you.
So we're now ready to take questions. Does anyone have, shall I moderate from here, Rebecca? Is that good? So anyone have any questions, please raise your hands, and then I'll kind of select you as you raise your hand. Yes, Tom.
What is the role of beauty in transmodernism?
Is that to the entire panel?
Well, one falls back on Dave Hickey's definition of what beauty is in art, which is that which gives visual pleasure. There's another weird aspect about beauty, which is going to sound intensely flaky. It is. In the book The Celestine Prophecy, The Third Insight, this is an atrocious book. I mean, I'm sort of a new ager myself, but that's beside the point. This book is an awful book. However, in Insight number 3, it is suggested, which is a very interesting idea, that beauty is energizing. That which is beautiful is energizing, and it's really kind of obvious. Now, I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know about any research that's been done about this, but I think that one thing about beauty is that it is certainly something, and God knows how we define beauty. Different people define beauty in a lot of different ways. But the idea of beauty itself being a positive value. Now you can critique the hell out of the male gaze and strategies for beautification, which are culturally engendered and all this stuff. That's very real. It's very serious. But when you talk about something like beauty in art, again, this thing that Dave Hickey said in the early '90s, which got him a big fat prize, makes a certain amount of sense, because it is a matter of something which gives us visual pleasure. Hickey also goes on in that same essay to talk about the idea that it is in traditional modernist art. Art is supposed to be good for you. It's supposed to teach you something. There's supposed to be a therapeutic kind of quality to it. And Hickey says, we don't need that. We just want to have some good times. Well, it sounds a little hedonistic and a little sort of value loose, but all right, that's my bit about beauty. I won't say.
I think it's interesting. I'm teaching this class on transcultural aesthetics and contemporary design, which I probably could have talked about equally in my presentation. And one of the things that's really interesting as we talk about beauty is that in a lot of other places, beauty is not sort of the sense of the visual aesthetics, but how something functions in harmony with the universe is a way to sort of explain it. And so it's been very interesting, because again, I work at the sort of information design, where it's not about cool visual aesthetics, which is sometimes it's hard to recruit designers to engage with this kind of work, because it's not about the cool hotness. It's about beauty in another sense of like, does it function in harmony with all of these people who actually need to engage in this particular type of process? And so the transcendence is the sort of the way in which we think of sort of visual aesthetic transcendence, but the transcendence is about whether or not the values that are part of our understanding of democracy and the value of democracy, if those things are actually made manifest in the experiences they have with the interaction with the stuff of government.
I'll just make a brief note. I mean, I think that I agree with that, and I'll just talk about it in the context of this festival, so that's what I'm focusing on. But in terms of viewing visual art or traditional art forms, there's really kind of not easy, but I mean, there's clear cultural value placed on what's beautiful and what's not. We can probably all identify that. And I think that it is important, say in the terms of performance art festival or an art and festival, there's a lot of multidisciplinary work, that the processes can be beautiful, the subtlety of the exchanges between people can be beautiful, the actual event itself and the kind of confluence of people, there can be a beauty in that, but looking again not at the beauty of a canvas, but looking at the canvas as time, space, relationship, interaction, and of course kind of finding your way through that yourself. And it's not usually a normal experience for people who are looking for that big boom beauty. It solves my problem for the moment. So.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question for Craig.
Oh,
James.
A couple of times during the talk you referred to transmodernism as being scary.
yeah.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Because judging by the rest of your presentation and also Catherine's presentation, transmodernism is something very exhilarating and forward-looking, energizing. But is there something in the practice of transmodernism that's also frightening?
Essentially, what I would say that and I know I use the word a lot, and I mean it, sort of. Basically, one of the things that we're confronting a lot is the unknown. When you're confronting the unknown, it challenges a lot of things at once. It's one of the difficulties about the idea that when we were like embracing a postmodernist rubric, postmodernism had to do with a closed inquiry. Effectively, you analyze things, in many respects, you analyze things according to language. In other words, you scientize the issue. If you scientize the issue by either making cultural practice an issue that can be dealt with language, or a cultural practice that can be dealt with through psychology. And both of those kind of scientific disciplines, language theory and psychology, were places that postmodernity could take shelter in. The transmodern takes shelter in practically nothing. There is no shelter. It's all open. Basically, and the thing with, I mean, I agree fully that this is the activeness, the positivity, there's no way that transmodernity necessarily is going to be engaged in non-proactive activity, but see, it has to do with the idea of confronting a toxic waste dump and saying, instead of just driving by it, we're going to have to deal with it. And we're going to have to deal with it in the community. We're going to have to read about how you deal with a toxic waste dump, get people together, get the shovels out, wear some kind of protective stuff, and go out there and do this. Now, it's scary in some respects. It's also, enormously exhilarated in many respects, just because it's, it is obviously, it's an obvious public good. I think that it's scary to confront the question of whether or not human awareness survives the death of the physical body. Does it? I don't know. Well, we're not supposed to think about that. Well, the transmodern is going to think about that. Maybe we'll find out something. Maybe we'll find out something that really scares us. Maybe we'll find out, no matter what we find out, it's going to scare us, I think, a little bit. But the point is that anytime you break boundaries, that boundary breaking issue, I mean, one of the things about the boundary breaking issues that all of us are talking about have to do with sort of dealing with something uncertain and without necessarily emplacing control issues. Like with this wonderful plant, this young woman, the Vietnamese woman who makes these amazing things with peanut sauce and local herbs, you have to trust her that she's not going to poison you.
I have one note. This is just like it's kind of related, but in terms of the feminist gender aspects, this is just a note about anxiety and fear. But my partner's in medical school, and they've been studying gender and sexuality. And for parents who have new children, the most anxiety-provoking thing that they've measured so far is the child who is born with non-determinate gender. and non-determinate, it's a higher level of anxiety in a parent than a terminal disease. So I think that we have to think about, I think, and those are the ways that the rubber hit the road. It's sort of like what Craig's, sorry. What do you have to
Change my name.
It's terrible.
No,
I have a friend who looks very similar to you. His name's Craig. And he was like on the crazy Facebook with me today. But so there's things about where the rubber meets the road, you know, and a parent who has an infant of non-determinate sexuality, you know what I mean? And I broaden that out to gender expression in general. And now as women are in the world, you know, now as we're moving into like a really actual diversified world, you know, African American president, like it's all happening. Like we actually do have to deal with this now. So.
And again, it's the same thing where it's really fascinating with the work that we've been doing around ballot design. We went to all those sort of state, local places, you know, where all the legislators and stuff meet, and the state employees. And it was very interesting as they went to our booth, who would come to our booth and not, because they were sort of, there's a fear of like, what happens when you actually make voting more inclusive, right? Who's voting for which political party? And there are assumptions about if you make it more inclusive, which political party is going to win or not. So it was very fascinating to see that. And you know, I'm like, you know, I'll register as an independent. I have no agenda. This is just about, you know, being it more inclusive. But there's a tremendous amount of fear among certain groups of what does it mean to make democratic values accessible to everyone in a way that, again, the American history. It was not accessible. Traditional democracy, go back to the Greeks, it wasn't accessible to everyone. But in the contemporary moment, you know, all of these governments have to figure out what does it mean to make democracy accessible for people, and you end up getting, you know, results you don't expect. You know, it's like the Palestinians, let's let them vote. Oh, shoot. They didn't vote who we thought they were going to vote for, but we have to respect their democratic choices. And that's, I think, in the transmodern moment where the fear becomes, because when you open it up to everyone, you cannot control the results in the way that you did. It was easier to do so before.
Well, just to introduce a little bit of postmodern skepticism to this discussion, I was just, you know, because in one of the websites on in the Transmodern Festival, previous Transmodern Festival of 2006, it says, in the transmodern age, the fringe is the foreground, and the focus is given to those normally marginalized in the operations of normal society, women, minorities, gays, and lesbians. Now, the thing is that what struck me was that sometimes the fringe groups that, you know, that you talked about, Catherine, you talked about in your experimental culture groups, and that, Dori, you talked about with, you know, bringing democracy to, that I felt like perhaps there's much greater fragmentation among those groups. There's much greater fragmentation in these communities that we're talking about. And is there a possibility of translation of this idea of transmodern, of like inclusivity, and you know, is that something? What do you all feel about that? Just to the whole panel.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that within all of those groups, there's incredible fragmentation. I see incredible fragmentation in GLBT movement right now. I mean, it's incredibly fragmented. It's shattered in many directions. There's people who don't want gay people who are fighting against gay marriage because they think that that's heteronormative. You know what I mean? And that's going to ruin us all. You know what I mean? I mean, I think that there's value in continuing to push forward, saying there's a fringe that should be foregrounded, but I think that fringe is going to continue. It's not at all heterogeneous, and it's very fragmented and very. And I think it's an extremely valid question in terms of at the end of newspapers, sort of like there are these institutions and these standards that are part of our, you know, kind of liberal democracy, and what if they do? What are the fragmentation and the splintering, like what's happening with journalism? Where does that go? I don't know, and I do think that that's a very legitimate point, because it's not. Those aren't. This sort of a simplified way of putting it, but.
Well, I always felt those things were always fragmented. Again, what often happened though is that certain voices were so strong that it drowned out all the other fragmentation. And so the fragmentation is actually a reflection of the fact that so many different groups can come to voice and come to action, so that that which was already there but just suppressed or hidden, all of a sudden becomes more apparent. And again, we don't know where it would go, but but that's because the we in this case is trying to figure out how do we control it to a certain agenda, right? And the moment that we sort of let go of the fact that we can control this to a certain agenda, then I think we feel less anxiety about being able to control those, and that we're okay with the fragmentation, because it just means that people are figuring out their own paths of how to go about doing things.
It's interesting in terms of fragmentation, because the whole thing, any cutting edge of any, when a cutting edge is active, there's an awful lot of energy along the edge, and that energy oftentimes, if you think about, this is really kind of obvious, but if you think about the early 20th century when abstraction first started getting rolling, you had this huge range of different abstract practices that were really significant and really antithetical to some extent. I mean, it was like suprematism was very, very different than Mondrian's operations, and so that you've got these differences, but these differences may contribute to whatever comes back from the wars, may be of some real use. But I know what you mean. The fragmentation thing's really quite real.
And Jerry?
This would be a general question. The computer seems to be at the heart of what is happening right now. Communication is wide open and uncontrollable. No country can restrict it forever. They may, sooner or later, they break through it. There's all kinds of communication at so many different levels that everybody can have a voice. It seems like this seems to be the central part of transmodernism. I was wondering if, it looks like you're all agreed.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you might have further observations on that.
Well, I just think it's interesting because, being from the post-internet world, and I just always use this, it's really the immediacy of the communication cycles in terms of, and it's also changing underground culture. I mean, it used to be like myself, you're from a small town, I had to, I came out at the age of 17, I had to go physically to a bar to meet other gay people. And then I had to physically go to a club and see like a punk rock band that somebody called me on the phone and told me was good, even though I don't really like punk rock, but but there was this moving through time and space, handing of a magazine or a book, having to go to the certain town to get the record from the album, from the Genesis Peorage Throbbing Gristle record you had to have. You had to drive there, you had to convince your parent to drive you there. And now all of that information is completely immediate. If you're like a gay teenager in Atlanta, you can find your exact match in Alaska, and you can meet, in Illinois in like 15 minutes. And I don't know what this rapid cycling also makes the underground completely exposed. So it's not a process of personal exploration or personal discovery. You can learn everything there is to know about ska in 15 minutes.
Google.
This is very different reality, and it exposes the underground and makes it completely transparent. So I don't actually know what this means. I'm really like totally perplexed by it, like how this affects originality, how this affects authenticity, and how this affects the treasure of the moving through space and time of being a teenager and coming into being an adult. But I think it's
certainly a different social climate than we've ever had before. There's nothing in the past that in any way equals what that computer and the internet has done in such a short amount of time.
It's funny too, because one thing that seems to be on a lot of people's minds is literally this loss of the hands, the craft work, the hand-painted gesture, whatever it is. It seems as if they're as much as computerization is completely dominating our lives massively. I mean, it's in a totally frightening way. I mean, there's the fear word. Anyway, when I have two computers and one of them goes crazy, I become a 4-year-old. I mean, a real 4-year-old. It's bad. It's good nobody's there. But that's it's a dangerous set of circumstances to be that dependent on electronic media. I'm fundamentally, radically dependent on electronic media.
I have 4 at this point.
Right, I totally understand. But the other side of it is the degree to which we, the degree to which it humanizes us. I mean, one thing so wonderful about the Obama campaign was literally that we, as much as it was very, very electronic, it also brought a great number. It was very people unifying. You didn't see people at Obama rallies on their laptops. They were all hanging out.
But the technology was used to support human communication, because it's one of those things, because Obama had my email address, then I could go and do a meetup, on the website to meet real people in their homes. And it's like the last week before the election, I literally received 10 phone calls from real people, as part of his election campaign, calling me, telling me to go vote, right? And so there's a way in which, the technology it mediates now more increased human interaction.
Yeah, we got to the point where we were afraid to answer the phone for somebody calls.
Right. But what's really, again, interesting for me with the sort of voting thing is that the anxiety around the touch screen, which again is the most, election officials talk about the fact okay, I can program this thing to accommodate the 15 languages that are the most popular in the city of Chicago. And all they have to do, in the same way like you go to your ATM, I could choose Polish, I could choose this. And that whole entire experience is mediated in the language that they actually speak in ways that is much cheaper than having to print out, 100,000 ballots in Polish, or even bilingual, right? And so there's a way in which, the anxiety around the touch screen as a sort of technology has to do partly with the fact that it makes, again, the experience of voting more immediate for people whom it was this serious barrier. For people with, you can have the sound if you have a hearing disability, you can have the sort of sound there so that you can follow the ballot this way. You have a visual disability, you can change the size of the type or the color or the contrast. All the different ways in which, before you would have to have someone literally standing next to you to navigate the ballot, which now you can do independently yourself. And that, again, is frightening for some people. And it's frightening for people who were not as engaged in the democratic process before. And now all of a sudden they have to become informed citizens in a way that they were allowed to just sort of get by, or use the sort of lack of accessibility as a way to get by.
Turning that towards art, wouldn't that be what's happening with art? It's becoming fully democratic. That as an artist you can create a portfolio, an exhibition, put it on the internet, and anyone in the world can look at it.
Yeah. I think also I was watching this interview with Genesis Pure. I don't know anything about him, but if the tangible world becomes more of a rarefied experience and the online experience becomes more a normal experience, then there probably will be reactive movements toward tangible reality, such that people will reject, online activity and, try to spend large periods of time in tangible world.
So there's one more question, and there are 2 more questions. So we'll, so is it directed to one person?
No, it's to the entire panel pretty much.
Okay.
It seemed to me in the 3 lectures that the idea of transmodernism was heavily interlaced with the idea of accessing and allowing other cultures to access culture. So different cultures, views, backgrounds. So do you see transmodernism as allowing these views to remain distinct, having them slightly influence each other, or becoming kind of one big unified whole? What is the end picture of transmodernism in relation to its reliance on diversity?
Well, one thing for sure is that you're, for example, I'm teaching a course right now in alternative aesthetics, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, about how Japanese aesthetics has to do with an appreciation of different types of beauty, which in some respects have a lot to do with flawed beauty, because it's more realistic. But there's a whole hierarchy and a whole sort of language of why it is this is, an imperfection is beautiful. Okay, you look at the paintings in Aboriginal culture, Australian Aboriginal culture, that look like abstract paintings, but they're not. They're rituals. They're not really paintings at all. Even though they are paintings, they're not. So you're not going to be able to bring Japanese aesthetics and Aboriginal painting together in any fashion. They're not going to talk to each other. There's no crosstalk that really is of much use. But Carl Jung said 1,000,000 years ago that contradiction produces consciousness. I forget where, but I always kind of hold on to it. And what we're looking at, I think, is definitely this diversity has to do with identity. Every human being is different. Therefore, every culture has its own kind of identity to protect in a way. One of the great fallacies in terms of contemporary art is this idea that contemporary art is just taking care of everything. Where everything is cool. We got it. We understand Icelandic film. We understand plays in South Korea involving, never mind. I won't go into, but there's this assumption that we're all like, the contemporary art embraces all this stuff effortlessly. It does not. There is a very powerful canon involved in contemporary art, and it's very stiff. It's not very transmodern yet, as far as I can tell. But I think that we're going to see that we're going to find weird ways in which we connect and beautiful ways in which we are autonomous. That sounds this.
Yeah, I think, to my perspective, the transmodern respects traditional cultures. Now, like Craig said, that doesn't mean there's an end of the. God, doesn't mean there's the end of the. God, like something's wrong with me. Doesn't mean there's that. Doesn't mean that that's like that there's the end of the conflicts that exist between them, which will always be there. And I think that it embraces that. But in terms of just like, there are things about, there's not an expectation, it's not like in contemporary art where it's kind of fetishized, but it is respected as human endeavor. And just in my personal experience, when I was working on this environmental documentary in southern West Virginia, and I worked with a ton of evangelical Christians. And it's like we want to respect Islamic culture. They may want me to be dead. You know what I mean? We haven't resolved that at all. So.
And Fred, you had a question?
Well, I hate to end on a skeptical question, but I just, sitting listening to this, I'm thinking most of the things that you described as characterizing transmodernism sound like things that have been in play through all of the 20th century. And if anything, these are constants rather than some categorical shift into new territory.
Yeah, one thing for sure is I had an epiphany about 2 years ago that basically the transmodern contained the postmodern fundamentally, so that it was as if, okay, well, it's still the same carrier wave, and it's still modernism. First and last, it's still modernism. First and last, it's a condition in which all that is solid melts into air. We are always, culturally, we face an unknown. We started out facing an unknown at the beginning part of the end of the 19th century, and we're still doing this. It's the same damn unknown. It's not like it's changed any. I think what appears to be what I think some of the salient aspects of different people talk about transmodernity in terms of how it's different than postmodernity, and postmodernity is considered a refractive, back-facing, navel-gazing to some extent activity, but you can't. In other words, it's art analyzing itself psychologically and analyzing its languages in terms of language structure, scientizing, rather than experiencing. But frankly, I understand what you mean. That it's just a matter of the label of postmodernity is tiresome, and in some respects the idea of there being another phase of modernism we're in. It feels true. First and last, I totally agree with you. It's all modernism.
I mean,
Well,
But we- I think
actually,
Dori has a
yeah,
different viewpoint.
because I would actually say.
oh, no, I know what you mean. I agree. So, I
It's
can't
like,
strike
no,
that.
not even,
She
no,
has a
but
good point.
but again, it's like, I can say 1964 and 1965, the world shifted for a lot of people. And that the sort of, and it's one of those things like, one of my professors always used to say, you postmodern generation, and I always found that disturbing because, again, one of the things that postmodernism denies is a certain kind of essentialist position
Right.
on identity, which in the sort of transmodern period actually accepts that you can have essentialized positionalities in a way that is not possible before. And this is particularly really interesting in terms of dealing with my students of color and my international students in the graphic design program at my school, where my program is very much a sort of very modernist. They espouse a very modernist aesthetic, and that my students, my international students and my students of color really struggle against that because they cannot find a place for their identity in that tradition. And they find the sort of universalizing tendencies of it actually imperialistic, to say it sort of plainly. So I do think that post 1964, post 1965, there actually is a tremendous difference in terms of an opening of the aesthetic discourse and the aesthetic practice for positions of essentialized identities that was not there before. And I think that is actually, so it's like you can have, a Islamic democracy which does not look like the United States. And there's the opening of that possibility, which is not there before, which was not part of necessarily the modernist discourse or especially the modernist practice. And again, postmodernism says, you can't, there's, there's no essentialism, so everyone is equal. And that's the sort of critique that I think transmodernism actually has in the postmodernism, is that, you can, have essentialized identities from which to speak about what is going on in the world, and that needs to be respected.
Yeah, and sort of culturing people out of it is a failed solution, in a way.
Okay, we can continue the conversation at the reception. Thank you all so much.